"Who dared touch my plane?" The loud voice cut through the cold air of the English airfield like a shot from a gun. It was December 1943. Snow fell softly around the large shape of a damaged P-47 fighter plane, its metal shell still smoking from its last trip over France. The pilot, Lieutenant Joe Ringo Haynes, marched angrily across the runway, his flight coat flapping in the breeze. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. The repair crew stopped what they were doing. Near the back of the plane, a man covered in grease did not even look up from his wrench. "That was me," said Sergeant Tom Kelly. "She needed a little help to stay in the air." Ringo stared, his eyes wide. "Help? You cut open the main engine cover." Kelly simply shrugged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The manual said she was getting too hot. I fixed the heat problem." The pilot's voice grew louder. "You can't just slice into a government aircraft." Kelly's calm answer stopped everyone instantly. "I guess I just canceled the guarantee on a warplane." For a moment there was quiet. Then someone laughed. But the humor didn't last. Everyone knew what his actions meant. Kelly had broken Army flying rules, clearly and simply. What he had done was not just risky, it was against the law. The P-47 had a reputation. People called it a flying tank. It was big, slow, difficult, and likely to get too hot if pushed hard. Pilots disliked it. Mechanics cursed it. But Kelly saw something different, a sleeping beast waiting to be woken up. He had spent his younger days under the hot Oklahoma sun, fixing tractors and pickup trucks, machines that shook and sputtered, but always got the job done. To him, the plane was not a failure. It was a problem to solve. "The Army calls her a fighter," he once told a friend. "But I call her a hammer. You just have to swing it right." The official fix from headquarters was simple. Stop flying trips until new pieces arrived from the States. Kelly looked at the supply list and gave a bitter laugh. 3 weeks for new parts, he muttered. That means 3 weeks of men dying. That night, after the last engine stopped and the field lights grew dim, Kelly remained behind. The repair shed smelled of oil and burnt metal. He climbed the maintenance ladder, flashlight held between his teeth, and started cutting into the P-47's air intake system. Every spark was a potential military trial. Every loud clang of his wrench echoed like a gunshot in the empty night. He did not care. He was not looking for fame. He was trying to keep his friends alive. Hours went by. When the sun appeared, the mechanics found him still working, eyes red, hands raw. He had shaped the metal engine cover with his own tools, changed the path of the air ducts, and welded a temporary plate from scrap aluminum taken from a wrecked Spitfire. It looked terrible, like someone had attached farm tools onto a fighter jet. But the airflow numbers did not lie. When he hit the starter button, the engine roared, not the rough blocked sound everyone was used to, but a clean, powerful noise. The heat needle stayed cool, no overheating, no smoke. Kelly leaned back against the plane's body, tired, but smiling. "You're not a jug," he said softly, patting the metal. "You're a bull." The next morning, Ringo Haynes flew that exact plane over the channel. What happened next would make the P-47 Thunderbolt a legend and turn Tom Kelly into the most dangerous kind of mechanic, the one who did not need permission to save the world. Before Kelly's unauthorized repair, the P-47 Thunderbolt was the joke of every meeting tent in England. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or as most people said, a flying milk jug. It was large, heavy, and slow-moving at low height. It could not climb quickly enough to catch a Messerschmitt, and it could not turn sharp enough to fight closely with a Focke-Wulf. To the men risking their lives every day, the P-47 felt less like a fighter plane and more like a bad gamble. "Every time I take her up," one pilot complained, "I feel like I'm riding a safe with wings." Even the Germans made fun of it. German reports joked that it was a plane better suited for carrying milk than for battle. The smooth Bf-109s and FW-190s of the German Air Force could dive, turn, and climb with grace. The Thunderbolt just pushed through the air like a big, clumsy fighter, loud, rough, and inefficient. But to Tom Kelly, that strength was everything. He had grown up in the Dust Bowl, where nothing ever worked the way it was supposed to. The tractors broke down daily. The wind whistled through holes in the house. When the Depression hit, his father lost the farm. But Tom never lost the habit of fixing what others threw away. "If it moves, it can fight," he used to say. So when he was drafted into the Army Air Forces, he did not see the P-47's flaws. He saw opportunity. An engine so strong it could lift a very heavy load, wings that could take hits from cannons and keep flying, and a body built like a steel anvil. He just needed to make the airflow match the engine's power. Still, every day he had to listen to the same complaints. Pilots called the P-47 a death sentence. Mechanics grumbled that even normal repairs required 2 men and a prayer. And headquarters, stuck in office paperwork, sent out endless notes about strictly following the plans exactly. Kelly ignored most of them. He had read enough technical guides to know what the engineers thought the plane could do. But he also watched men die because those same engineers were not the ones fighting gravity at 20,000 feet. The rules said, "Don't touch the air ducts." Kelly's gut told him the ducts were blocking the engine like a tight rope. That struggle between the rule book and what was real defined life on that airfield. At the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hubert Zemke, every pilot and crewman felt the pressure. They were supposed to stop the German Air Force from tearing Allied bombers apart, but their aircraft kept failing them. By the time the replacement parts arrived, another mission would be over, and another pilot might never come back. One morning, after pulling a shot-up Thunderbolt that barely made it home, Kelly found the ground crew staring at the melted engine cover. The heat had twisted the panels and broken the turbocharger seals. "She wasn't flying," one mechanic said quietly. "She was dying in the air." Kelly did not answer. He just ran his hand along the burnt metal. He could feel where the airflow had failed. He knew exactly where to start. That night, as the squadron slept, he began drawing his plan in grease pencil on the hangar wall. Widened ducts, new airflow path, and a custom plate shaped from old Spitfire parts. The idea was simple. Feed the beast more air, and it will live longer. To most people, it was insane. To him, it was common sense. "The jug is not a joke," he said to himself, marking the diagram with one last line. "It's a hammer. All it needs is a better handle." And that is when Tom Kelly chose to do the one thing every mechanic knew not to do: break the rules of war and the laws of engineering. Before Tom Kelly became the man who changed the Thunderbolt's fate, he was just another oily mechanic from the flat fields of Oklahoma. Born in 1915, he grew up during the Dust Bowl, a time when machines were more important than hopes. His father fixed tractors for farmers who could barely afford fuel, and young Tom spent his childhood covered in oil, tightening bolts, and cleaning parts. When he was not fixing engines, he was racing old cars down dirt roads, building his first sense of speed, power, and what metal could handle before it broke. He used to say, "You don't need blueprints when you can feel how the engine breathes." That sharp feeling, the ability to listen to machinery as if it spoke, was what set him apart from the beginning. When America entered the war in 1941, Kelly did not join for fame. He joined because he wanted to fix airplanes. "Every man has a skill," he told the recruiter. "Mine is making things work when they should not." By 1943, he was working at an Allied airfield in southeast England with the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a group that would soon become famous as Zemke's Wolfpack. It was a messy world. The airfield was a mix of mud, tents, and metal sheds. Every morning began with the smell of plane fuel and burnt oil. Mechanics worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. In cold weather so terrible, their hands stuck to the tools, but nobody complained much. They were keeping men alive. Kelly quickly became known as the kind of man who did not wait for commands. If an engine failed, he took it apart. If a radio jammed, he fixed the wires himself. Once, when a flight leader's landing gear got stuck while coming down, Kelly drove a Jeep onto the runway with a torch and freed it by hand, while the plane stayed above. The pilot later said, "That man's got ice where the rest of us have nerves." But Kelly was not fearless. He was angry at how often men died for silly reasons. "You can't fight a war with perfect paperwork," he grumbled to another mechanic. "You fight it with hard work and steel." He did not see airplanes as machines. He saw them as living things, each with their own feeling. "Some birds are difficult," he would say. "You have to talk them into flying." When the P-47 Thunderbolt arrived at the base, Kelly saw a misunderstood beast. The pilots called it too heavy, too clumsy. The engineers called it good enough to fly. Kelly called it not finished. Every time a Thunderbolt came back from battle, smoking and half dead, Kelly would crawl beneath it, looking at the bullet holes, tracing the heat marks, smelling the oil. He could tell from the smell whether the problem was in the fuel mix or the cooling system. "Machines leave signs," he told the new crewman. "You just have to listen." That intense focus on detail earned him the respect of pilots, but not the love of officers. To them, he was a danger. He questioned everything. "Sir," he once said to a captain inspecting his shed, "you can follow the manual all you want, but that manual ain't never seen combat." The captain frowned. "Neither have you, Sergeant." Kelly smiled gently. "No, sir, but I fixed the planes of the men who have." By late 1943, the Allied fight over Europe was growing. Bombers needed fighter protection, and the German Air Force still ruled the high skies. The 56th Fighter Group was supposed to change that, but their Thunderbolts kept getting too hot, catching fire, and failing before they could even reach the fight. The officers blamed the pilots. The pilots blamed the machines. But Kelly knew the truth. The P-47 was not broken. It was held back by its own plans, and he was the only one brave enough to prove it. By the winter of 1943, frustration was the common talk of the 56th Fighter Group. Every flight seemed to end with at least one P-47 returning slowly, smoking, or not coming back at all. The pilots blamed the mechanics blamed the engineers, and the engineers, miles away in New York, blamed poor maintenance under battle conditions. The truth was worse. The Thunderbolt's huge Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a great machine on paper, was having trouble breathing when used. The turbocharger got too hot under strain. Oil collected where it should not. Pilots who climbed too hard saw their temperatures jump into the red zone, followed by a bad sound from the engine and silence. "Another one's cooked," the ground crews would whisper as they watched yet another fighter glide in without engine power over the field, landing gear scraping sparks across the runway. Kelly had seen enough. He knew the main problem was not the engine. It was the airflow. The ducts feeding the supercharger were too small, and the engine cover trapped heat. Like a stove, it was a design made for paper, not battle. He had watched Lieutenant Ringo Haynes barely climb out of his plane last week after his oil pressure dropped to nothing. When Kelly looked at the wreck, he saw the same signs again: baked metal, burned wires, coolant boiling out of the vents. "They're dying of thirst," he told his crew, kicking at a pile of tools. "Engines need to breathe, and this one's choking." One of the mechanics, a nervous young man named Franks, looked up. "But the manual says we can't touch the ducting without an official request order." Kelly gave him a long look. "Did the manual ever watch a man burn to death because his turbo line froze?" That made him quiet. The Army Air Forces had a clear rule: no changes without permission. Every aircraft was government property. Unauthorized changes could mean a military trial. But to Kelly, rules written by engineers who never left their offices were not laws. They were blocks in the way. That night, he went to the hangar long after the lights were out. The place was silent except for the groan of metal cooling in the cold. He set his coffee container on the wing, pulled a wrench from his pocket, and started working. He took off the front cover showing the monstrous radial engine, a tangled mess of tubes, wires, and bolts. He had memorized its makeup from countless repairs, but now he was looking at it like a surgeon about to break every medical code in the book. He widened the intake by cutting through the aluminum with a hand saw. Then, using old tubing from a wrecked Spitfire, he changed the path of the airflow to go around the heat trap near the supercharger. For good measure, he fastened a crude plate near the exhaust, something he had once done on a tractor engine back home. It was rough, it was ugly, it was completely illegal. When he finished, dawn was arriving. He sat back on the wing, covered in oil and soot, and stared at what he had created. The once smooth fighter now had an uneven bump on its side. It looked like an injured animal, but he did not care about how it looked. He cared about how it worked. The next morning, the airfield was buzzing about Kelly's move. His crew whispered that the sergeant had gone crazy. Even Ringo Haynes, the pilot who had almost died last week, thought he had lost his mind. "Tom," Ringo said, shaking his head, "you know they'll hang you for this, right?" Kelly grinned. "Maybe, but they'll hang me with a wrench in my hand, not a rule book." Later that day, the changed P-47 sat shining in the winter light. Its engine purred with a sound no one had heard before, smooth, deep, confident. Kelly took a step back and said quietly, "Let's see if breaking the rules can keep men alive." It would, and within weeks, the skies over Europe would prove it. When Kelly's commanding officer finally saw what he had done, the response was immediate. "What in God's name did you do to that aircraft, Sergeant?" Kelly stood straight, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Improved it, sir." "Improved it?" the officer shouted, walking around the changed P-47 like it was a crime scene. "You destroyed government property. You broke Rule 42 of the Maintenance Code and half the damned Army Air Force rules." Kelly did not flinch. "And I might have saved a few lives while I was at it." The officer opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the hangar filled with the roar of the Thunderbolt's engine. One of the mechanics had climbed in and hit the starter. The R-2800 roared to life. Not the uneven sound they had all grown used to, but a deep, steady thunder. The sound filled the space, shaking the floor like a living heartbeat. Everyone stopped talking. The dials were perfect. Oil pressure stable, temperature steady, no overheating. Kelly's new ducting system was feeding the turbocharger evenly. Even the exhaust looked cleaner. The officer just stared, unable to hide his surprise. "You're lucky this works, Sergeant. You're still going to have to explain yourself to command." Kelly nodded. "Yes, sir. But first, let's get it tested where it matters. Up there." That test would come sooner than anyone thought. Lieutenant Ringo Haynes, the fiery pilot who had nearly died in one of the old Thunderbolts, chose to fly Kelly's modified aircraft. "If it explodes," he joked sadly, "I'll haunt you." Kelly smirked. "Deal. Just don't stop her. She's moody until she knows you mean business." When Ringo climbed into the cockpit, the rest of the airfield gathered around. The plane looked silly. Its quickly cut cover and mixed metal patches made it look like a Frankenstein's monster. But when Ringo hit the gas, the aircraft jumped forward with a power no one expected. The wheels left the ground in half the usual distance. The modified Thunderbolt climbed like a different type of plane entirely, cutting through the gray English sky with raw power. The radio crackled. "Temp steady at 10,000, 15, 20, no overheating." Kelly's hands closed into fists as the voice continued. "Wow, Kelly, she's smooth. Never flown anything like this." The hangar broke out in cheers. Even the commanding officer could not hide his smile. But Kelly did not cheer. He just let out a long, slow breath. He knew this was not the end. It was the start of trouble. Word spread quickly. Other mechanics wanted to see his drawings. Pilots started asking if their planes could get the Kelly fix. The officers, of course, wanted none of it. Sergeant Kelly, the major in charge of engineering, finally said, "You are not allowed to make changes to battle aircraft." Kelly just looked him in the eye. "Then allow it, sir." The major frowned. "You think this is a democracy?" Kelly's voice became firm. "No, sir. I think it's a war." For a week, his future was uncertain. He kept working quietly, making the same airflow changes in secret whenever a plane came in for repair. He did not sign off the changes officially. He just made them happen. By the time the officers realized how common the change had become, something else occurred. P-47s with Kelly's fix were flying better in every way that could be measured. Fewer failures, quicker climbs, cooler engines. The Air Force had a problem. It could not punish success. A note from headquarters quietly went around a month later. Field maintenance modification approved for continued evaluation. That was military code for, don't ask who did it, but keep doing it. Tom Kelly did not need medals or praise. All he needed was the sound of a Thunderbolt returning safely to base, engine purring, pilot alive. That sound to him was victory. 2 weeks later, Kelly's unauthorized fix faced its first real test. It was March 1944, and the 56th Fighter Group had been given the job of protecting a daylight bomb raid over Germany. The target? Factories outside Hanover that gave the German war machine engines, bullets, and steel. The German Air Force had been waiting. As the group of B-17s climbed past 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolts, some changed, some not, formed up to guard them. Among them was Lieutenant Ringo Haynes, flying the same patched-up P-47 that Kelly had worked on against orders. Kelly stood at the airfield staring at the distant line where the sky meets the ground as the sound of engines lessened. He knew what they were flying into: anti-aircraft fire, fighters, disorder. And he knew that if his repair failed, the blame would fall straight onto him. Hours later, the radio at the command post started crackling. The first parts of the battle reached them in bursts of static and yelled messages. Enemy planes 12 or high, Messerschmitts everywhere, Red 2's hit, he's pulling up, he's climbing. This Thunderbolt's running hot. Wait, temp dropping back, she's holding steady. Kelly froze. That last voice, it was Haynes. For 30 minutes, the airwaves became a messy mix of gunfire and prayer. The German Air Force had thrown everything it had into the fight. Dozens of FW-190s and Bf-109s sliced into the bomber groups, while Thunderbolts dove, rolled, and climbed in answer. At one point, Haynes's wingman took a burst of cannon fire and spun away. Haynes rolled upside down, chasing the German fighter that had fired the shot. Normally, the P-47's engine would have gotten too hot in such a long climb, but not this one. "Engine is cool, Kelly," he yelled over the radio. "Cool as the other side of hell." He got close behind the enemy plane, lined up the shot, and fired a short burst from his .850 caliber guns. The German fighter exploded mid-air, a ball of fire against the cold northern sky. Back at base, the hours dragged on. Mechanics smoked nervously. The officers pretended to read reports. Kelly just sat on a fuel drum, staring at the runway, waiting for the sound. Then he heard it, a low, confident rumble in the distance. One by one, the Thunderbolts began to return. Some were damaged, some leaving smoke, but they were alive. When Haynes rolled to a stop, Kelly was already there, running beside the wing. The pilot opened the cockpit cover, his face smeared with oil and excitement. "She flew like she wanted to fight," Haynes yelled, smiling widely. "Didn't get too hot, didn't stop. I outclimbed 2 190s and sent one home in flames." Kelly just nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in months, his hands were not shaking from anger. They were shaking from relief. The report after the mission confirmed it. Every P-47 with Kelly's change returned safely. 2 of the planes without the change had been lost to engine failure during the same trip. The difference was clear. When the results reached the top officers, they did not send praise. They sent an order. All field modifications approved for immediate standardization across the 8th Air Force. That meant Kelly's illegal fix had just become official policy. In the following weeks, bomber crews started noticing something odd. The Thunderbolts protecting them were not falling out of formation anymore. They were faster, more powerful, more dependable. The German pilots noticed it too. Reports from German intelligence said the P-47s were showing unusual endurance and cooling success. Kelly did not need a medal. The proof was in every pilot who came home alive. That night after the mission, the mechanics put together a party in the hangar. Cheap beer, poor music, laughter echoing through the cold English night. Haynes raised a bottle to him. "Tom," he said, "you didn't just fix a plane, you fixed the odds." Kelly took the bottle, but did not drink. He just smiled gently. All I did was let her breathe. By April 1944, the results of Kelly's change were impossible to ignore. P-47 groups fitted with his airflow redesign were flying better than every other group in the European area. The information spoke for itself. Lower failure rates, higher mission completion, and longer flying time. Pilots were returning from deep strikes over enemy territory, still with power left over. But victory has a way of attracting notice and close looks. One gray morning, Kelly was called to headquarters. He walked into a small room with plain walls and a single wooden desk. 3 officers sat waiting, their faces blank, their folders thick with paper. "Sergeant Kelly," the colonel began, "we've looked over your maintenance reports, or rather the lack of them. You've made unauthorized changes to many government aircraft. Do you deny this?" Kelly stood at attention, meeting the colonel's eyes. "No, sir, I don't deny it." "Then you understand how serious what you've done is?" "Yes, sir. But I also understand that those planes are coming back with pilots still breathing." A tight silence filled the room. One of the officers tapped a pencil against the table. Another flipped through a report. Finally, the colonel leaned back. "You realize this kind of action, while it has good results, can't be officially encouraged. It sets a bad example. We can't have every mechanic making up changes on million-dollar equipment." Kelly did not answer. He did not have to. They all knew the truth. His fix had saved many aircraft and lives. The colonel sighed. "You'll receive a formal warning in your file, but off the record." He paused, a small smile crossing his face. "Good work, Sergeant. Keep saving our boys." It was not praise, but it was permission. That night, Kelly returned to the hangar, tired but smiling. The men were waiting for him, eager for news. "Did they have a military trial for you?" Franks asked. Kelly shook his head. "Not yet. They just told me to stop doing what I'm doing." "So, you're stopping?" another mechanic asked. Kelly grinned. "Didn't say that either." The men laughed. For the first time, the hangar felt alive, like a place where they were making history, not just repairs. In the following months, Kelly kept improving the change, this time with quiet support from command. The Air Force never officially credited him, but field manuals began to include his airflow adjustments under recommended field adaptations. It was bureaucracy's way of saying, "We need this, but we'll never admit it came from a sergeant." Then came the letter. It arrived from the United States, sealed and marked confidential. It was not from the Army. It was from Pratt & Whitney, the engine maker. Someone at headquarters had sent Kelly's design to them. The letter thanked him for field information that improved how well the R2800 series worked. It even included a check for $200 and a signed note from one of the chief engineers. Sometimes the best engineers wear grease, not ties. Kelly folded the letter carefully and put it into his jacket pocket. He never cashed the check. By summer 1944, the Kelly fix, as pilots jokingly called it, had become standard across most Thunderbolt units. The results were amazing. Mission success rates rose, and battle losses from machine failure dropped quickly. Word reached even higher. A general visiting the base asked one of the group commanders, "Who the hell figured this out?" The commander shrugged. "Just some sergeant who didn't like reading manuals." The general laughed. "Good. Maybe we need more of those." Kelly never heard about it. He was too busy under the hood of another aircraft, sleeves rolled up, face smeared with oil, humming to himself as engines roared outside. To him, the war was not about fame. It was about work done correctly, even when no one was watching. And as long as those Thunderbolts kept flying, that was all the recognition he needed. By the end of 1944, Kelly's name had spread far beyond his own airfield. Pilots across England were talking about the junk plane that flew better than the German Air Force. Mechanics from other groups started writing to him for instructions. Most of them did not even know his name. They just called him the guy who made the P-47 breathe again. But to those who served with him, the legend was not about the machine. It was about the moment that one man decided to stop following the book and start following logic. One cold December morning, Kelly's fix met its biggest test. A huge bombing run was planned over the Ardennes, right as Hitler started his surprise counterattack. The weather was bad. The air was thick with anti-aircraft fire and cloud, and every pilot who climbed into a cockpit knew it could be their last trip. Kelly worked through the night tuning engines in the light of flickering lamps. He could barely feel his fingers. When one of the pilots, a young man from Kansas, barely 20 years old, came to check on his aircraft, Kelly looked up and said, "She'll bring you home." The pilot smiled. "You sound certain." Kelly tightened a final bolt. "I don't gamble." At dawn, the air shook with the roar of hundreds of Thunderbolts taking off together. Kelly stood on the runway, hat pulled low, watching them disappear into the gray distance. The mission was a mess. German fighters attacked the bombers the moment they crossed the front line. The radio network crackled with shouts, bursts of static, and sudden silence. "Enemy planes at 5. Engine hit. I'm losing oil pressure. Wait, stabilizing. She's still running. Kelly, that's genius. She's still running." Hours later, the first planes returned, damaged, burnt, but alive. The young pilot from Kansas rolled to a stop, cockpit cover open, smoke pouring from the wings. He jumped down, tears running down his face, and hugged Kelly before anyone could stop him. "She took a hit in the manifold. Any other plane would have blown apart, but yours, she just kept flying." Kelly just smiled and said, "Told you I don't gamble." That night, Command confirmed the results. Every P-47 changed under Kelly's design made it home that day. None had suffered a complete engine failure. For a moment, in the middle of a war that ended lives by the thousands, a handful of men had overcome the odds because one mechanic refused to follow orders. In the weeks that followed, pilots started marking their aircraft with a small symbol, a simple wrench painted beneath the cockpit. It was not official. It was not even a rule. But among Thunderbolt crews, it meant something simple. "This plane's been touched by Kelly's hands." Even the higher-ups noticed. A visiting general inspecting the base asked about the strange markings. When a pilot explained the story, the general simply said, "Keep him in the hangar then. He's worth a squadron." As the war neared its end, Kelly was offered a transfer to an engineering department in London. It was the kind of raise most enlisted men dreamed of. Offices, clean uniforms, no more cold nights on the runway. He turned it down. "They've got plenty of officers in London," he told his commanding officer. "What they don't have are enough mechanics who care." When the war finally ended, the 56th Fighter Group gathered for one last group flight. As the Thunderbolts roared overhead in a perfect line, Kelly stood alone by the runway, head tilted back, listening. To everyone else, it was just the sound of engines. To him, it was the sound of everything he had worked for. Proof that machines could have souls, that rules could bend for the right reasons, and that one act of going against orders could change the path of war. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the grease-stained note that Haynes had given him after the last mission. It said in shaky handwriting, We flew higher because you broke the rules." Kelly folded it again, slipped it into his jacket, and smiled. The junk plane had become a legend, and so had the man who fixed it. When peace finally came in 1945, the airfields of England began to go quiet. The once loud runways that had sent men into the sky daily now echoed only with the noise of tools being packed away. Mechanics took down tents, pilots signed transfer papers, and Kelly found himself standing in front of the same hangar door where it had all started. For the first time in years, he did not have a plane to fix. The squadron commander came up to him one afternoon with discharge papers and one sentence. "You've done your duty, Sergeant. Time to go home." Kelly looked around. The empty hangar, the fading oil marks on the concrete, the faint smell of fuel in the air. This was the only world he had known since before Pearl Harbor. "Home," he muttered quietly. "Guess I forgot what that looks like." He took a train back across England, then a ship back across the Atlantic Ocean. The trip home was strangely quiet. No engines to tune, no missions to get ready for, just endless water, and the uneasy silence that comes after years of noise. When he finally arrived in New Jersey, he was met not by a crowd, but by the hum of a nation rebuilding itself. Factories that had built engines for war were now making cars and tractors. The same lines that had fed his beloved Thunderbolts were creating a new kind of American future. One day he received a letter from a name he had not heard in months. Major Robert Cowboy Haynes, now back in Texas. The letter was short, written in Haynes's direct style. "Kelly, they're talking about putting your fix in the post-war P-47 manual. Said it improved airflow success by 7%. The boys are saying you saved more pilots than half the generals combined. Thought you'd want to know." Kelly laughed when he read it, not because of the nice words, but because the official Army Air Force Technical Bulletin now included the exact airflow change that had once been called unauthorized. The very line in the manual that might have condemned him during the war now carried his idea as standard procedure. It read, "In field conditions, mechanics are allowed to use changed engine plates and modified oil cooler ducts as per field experience reports." It did not say his name, but everyone who knew the story would recognize who field experience meant. After the war, Kelly worked briefly at a civilian aircraft company in Ohio. They offered him a comfortable office job, but he quit after 2 weeks. "I belong near engines," he told the foreman. He ended up back on the shop floor, working beside oil-stained men with the same rough hands he had known in England. Every so often, new workers would gather around him to hear stories of the war. One young mechanic asked, "Sergeant, is it true you broke rules to save those planes?" Kelly smiled. "Kid, I didn't break them. I just read between the lines." He never married, never looked for fame. But every year, veterans from his old group sent him Christmas cards, each one with a small symbol drawn at the bottom, a wrench beneath a pair of wings. By the early 1950s, his change had influenced the design of new jet engine cooling systems. Aviation engineers mentioned field-tested changes from wartime mechanics in their research papers. Again, no name, just a quiet legacy. Kelly did not mind. He never cared about credit, only results. One evening, sitting on his porch, he heard the distant rumble of a jet passing overhead. It was smooth, silver, and fast, a far cry from the old Thunderbolt. But as it disappeared into the clouds, Kelly smiled to himself. "Different engine," he whispered. "Same principle." He took a sip of his coffee, looked at the sky, and said softly, "If she flies, I did my part." And somewhere in a museum in England, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt bears a small engraving on its engine cover dedicated to the unnamed mechanic who made her breathe again. Decades later, long after the roar of piston engines had faded from the skies, a group of plane historians gathered at an air museum in Duxford, England. They were fixing an original P-47 Thunderbolt, one that had flown missions over Europe in 1944. Its paint was pale, its wings patched, but its heart, the huge Pratt & Whitney R2800, was still complete. During the repair, one of the volunteers found something unexpected inside the engine cover, a small piece of aluminum etched with barely visible letters beneath layers of dirt. It read simply, "Keep her breathing, Kelly." Nobody could say how it got there. There was no official record, no paper, no name in any history files. But the mechanics who found it fell silent for a long moment. They knew they were looking at a ghost's signature, a whisper from the man who had ignored orders to save lives. One of the volunteers, a retired engineer, said softly, "Whoever he was, he understood airplanes better than the rule book ever could." That single piece of metal became the main part of the exhibit, labeled Field Mechanic's Note, Origin Unknown. Visitors stared at it, wondering about the nameless man who had written it in the middle of war. Back in the United States, Kelly had died quietly years before. No medals, no headlines. His death certificate listed his job simply as aircraft mechanic. But among the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, his name lived on in the stories told at reunions. Major Haynes, older now, walking with a cane, would always raise his glass and say, "To Kelly, the man who made the Thunderbolt breathe fire." And every veteran in the room would nod, remembering the man who did not follow rules, but followed results. By the 1970s, flying had entered the jet age. Computers took the place of wrenches, and pilots relied more on systems than instincts. But deep in the manuals, the spirit of Kelly's resistance remained. The principle that if something does not work, fix it, even if no one has given you permission. It became the quiet belief of every good mechanic. Don't ask if it's allowed. Ask if it'll fly. A young Air Force cadet once found an old article describing a wartime field change that saved many P-47s. He brought it to his teacher and asked, "Sir, do you think it's true?" The instructor smiled. Every war has its Kelly, the kind of man who bends the rules so others can live. That's how things get better, by people who care more about results than regulations. Somewhere, that would have made Kelly smile. In 1989, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum opened a new exhibit on how plane repair changed during World War II. Hidden among the photos and charts was a single black and white picture, grainy, honest, and powerful. It showed a young mechanic standing deep in mud beside a Thunderbolt, sleeves rolled, hands on a wrench, a cigarette held between his teeth. The writing below read, "Unidentified U.S. Army Air Forces mechanic, England, 1944. Field changes like his kept American air power flying strong. No name, no rank." But that's how Kelly would have wanted it. Because his story was not about fame. It was about things working, about the courage to see a broken system and make it better, even if the manual said not to. That was the unwritten rule of every man who worked beneath the wings of history. Engines may roar, pilots may fly high, but it's the hands in the shadows that keep them both alive. As the museum lights dimmed that evening, the sound of a fixed R2800 engine filled the air, its deep growl shaking the glass walls. The visitors turned their heads toward the sound. For a moment, time folded back, and they could almost see him there again. Sergeant Kelly wiping his hands on a rag, squinting at the distant line where the sky meets the ground as another pilot took off in a machine he had made unkillable. And if you listened closely through the roar, you could almost hear his voice, calm and certain, carried by the echo of the propellers. "Just keep her breathing.